Thanks for coming, everybody. Oh, you're going to clap my head before I even talk. That's all right. Earlier this month, some of you may have noticed, it got some traction on the internet. Political scientist Mark Lynch wrote a piece for Foreign Policy, where he argued that academics in general, political scientists specifically, need to be writing for audiences more broadly, beyond peer-reviewed journals and books. And specifically, he was saying that we need to be blogging, and that we need to be encouraging academics to blog. And the thread was that we ought to learn something from Kendrick Lamar. I'm not kidding, so go back and read the article, it's fantastic. So comparing us to hip-hop, he says this: blog and other online publications should be seen as the equivalent of mixtapes in the hip-hop world. What he's talking about here is that sometimes you have to give it away. Sometimes you have to put it out there. Sometimes you have to get around the traditional structure and engage. And that's what we're doing in the 21st century. We have to understand it's a different world. It's a different media context. And we have some responsibilities. Interestingly, just this past weekend, Nicholas Kristof, in a widely circulated article in the New York Times, picks up on this same theme. His article is entitled, "Professors, We Need You!" Exclamation point. Exclamation point. All right? Professors, we need you. It's probably not something that you've thought a lot in the last couple of weeks, right? You're not tired of us. But he says, he's lamenting the fact that the word academic has become somewhat of a dismissal, as if that's just academic. That's just academic. It's a way to sort of push something aside, to not take it seriously, to in fact devalue it as opposed to heighten its value. And then he says, he calls on all of us to do better, at least most of us to do more. And here's the quote I wanted to read to you. "My one-time love, political science, is a particular offender of publishing indecipherable prose, and seems to be trying, in terms of practical impact, to commit suicide." Yeah, how about it? So my talk today is centered on what is the role of the political analyst in the 21st century. And the idea here is to try to understand the differences in backgrounds and approaches that different political analysts take. And as you'll see as this unfolds, one of the things that I find particularly challenging is that there is a lot of confusion because it's not clear how those roles are differentiated. So, that's me. I look particularly happy to be there. Maybe this is part of the problem. And this is the problem, is that we all look the same. I don't mean we all look like Italian kids from Pittsburgh. That's not what I mean. But I mean that we're sort of this image of there's the city of Chicago behind me, and even though this was a Toronto program, right? So they're indicating that I'm in Chicago, and I got my the professional attire, and I'm looking right into the camera and talking. Everybody looks like this, right? Everybody looks. You turn on the cable news, and everybody sort of looks like this. So how are you supposed to tell us apart? How are you supposed to? What's the difference, right? Let's first think about what political reporters do. Anchors and political reporters, people that we associate with the news. Let's watch this clip, a recent political story from the station that I work for here, CBS 2 Chicago. Let's watch this clip and then I have a few things to say.
They are all over the air, including our air. You simply cannot miss them.
Ads ahead of next month's Republican primary for governor. Chief Correspondent Jay Levine is here with a look at the attacks, counterattacks by candidates and their supporters. And Jay, what do you think?
I don't know, Kate, sometimes you don't want to miss them. They're actually entertaining, at least some of them are. But what's shaping up here is what could be the most expensive statewide primary ever, with new ads hitting the air every day, millions of dollars being spent by people we know and organizations we don't. Like today's counterattack by Rauner to a shadowy $1 million campaign against it.
Stand there.
You've seen the false attacks from Pat Quinn's allies and the Springfield insiders.
Trust Bruce Rauner to shake up Springfield? He's tied to people who shook it down.
These desperate attacks are coming from the same guys holding our state back.
The Illinois Freedom PAC, which is spending an estimated $1 to $2 million on those ads, says it's not affiliated with any candidate or candidates. Rauner, whose estimated $4 million Chicago TV budget, says he'd like to end all advertisements outside of the campaigns themselves, though some suspect he's behind the one currently blasting his three opponents.
More pay for them, higher taxes for you. That's what career politicians do. Career politicians like Bill Brady, Dan Rutherford, and Kurt Dillon.
Is running ads against everybody except Bruce Rauner. Now, that's not too hard to put together a political data point.
We tried to contact the Mid-America Fund, which has booked $200,000 worth of ads. When you go to their website, you see an all-Illinois homepage, though Rauner claims he'd never even heard of the group until the media started reporting on them.
I think they need to all get out there and talk about the issues that matter to the people of the state.
Rutherford says he plans to do just that with this ad. I'm going to get up in the morning and go to bed at night, focused on the fact of how we put more Illinoisans back to work. But the question is, will anyone still be listening when his ads start running in Chicago on March 4th?
Because Rauner, with a 20-point lead in at least one poll, could have it all wrapped up by then, 2 weeks before the primary. And the huge amount of money being spent by pro-Quinn, anti-Rauner forces who don't want a Quinn-Rauner race speaks volumes about how worried they are. Robin Kate.
So they figure they're try to tear down Rauner as they head into the primary here, hoping that they have a different opponent. But he does have that substantial lead according to the polls.
Yeah, with the school of thought being that Rauner would be the most difficult opponent that Pat Quinn could face, and so they want anyone but Rauner winning the Republican primary.
All right. Thank you, Jay.
So the anchors are there to help keep the story moving. Jay puts the story together himself as a reporter, and you see what he does is he goes and collects information, he does research, he interviews people, he finds new things out. I would never do any of those things. I would never do any of those things. It takes way too much work. I don't have the training for it. It's not what I'm called on to do, right? We'll talk about the role of the analyst in a second. But there's not a lot of opinion here, and there's not much analysis at all. I mean, he's making sense of it. He has to make it into a narrative. There was a little bit of back and forth, but essentially he's reporting more or less objective facts, or at least as they come from the people that are involved in the story, right? So there's that. Pundits are exactly opposite of this. Exactly opposite of this, right? They're not interviewing anybody necessarily, although they might have inside information based on their previous positions that they held. But let's watch how pundits work.
On Ohio, do you see a roadmap for Mitt Romney if he does not win Ohio?
No. Romney has, I'm not a big fan of the Electoral College, but the Founding Fathers gave it to us. Romney has a much tougher map. If you begin, as he should, presuming he'll carry every state John McCain did, then he still needs Indiana, which he's very strong, very good. North Carolina, which is easier than many of the other swing states, but not in the bag. Then it gets hard. Then he's got to have Ohio. Then even if he gets Ohio, get this, he's got to still win Virginia or Florida and Florida, Colorado. It's so hard for him to get to 270. And without Ohio, it's almost impossible.
Cornell, do you see this boiling down to the Electoral College versus the popular vote?
I think it is going to be Electoral College. And I think one of the interesting things is I think you'll see a tighter race state by state. I mean, look, on average, we won the battleground states by 7 or 8 points last time around in 2008. Well, we won't win those on average, 8 or 7 points this time around. So you'll see closer races in each of these states. But as they line up, the president has leads in all these states. The structure of this election has been fairly solid with him leading in all these states. So I think you'll see close state by state races. But the Electoral College, I think, will be a decisive victory for the president.
Are you one of these folks who said, there's polling, but your gut is telling you Romney based on enthusiasm on the ground?
Well, first, listen to the poll. We might as well cancel the election tomorrow. It's over. Romney can't get to 270. And he can get there without Ohio. Romney can get there.
Voting, don't worry.
Here's the other way to look at the same country that Paul was looking at. McCain numbers for Romney gets 179 electoral votes, 22 states. Throw in Indiana, North Carolina, Florida, which I think Romney's got Florida, Virginia. That's a close one right there. And don't forget Nebraska's 1. Obama got 1 in Nebraska. That goes McCain, and that goes Romney. That was at 248. After 248, if he gets Colorado, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin, he's the next president of the United States. Of course, if he gets Ohio, it's even a bigger margin. And all those states are absolutely possible. Every one of those states is possible.
Did you just say if your aunt had a mustache, we'd call her your uncle?
Yes, well, I got to think about that mustache next week.
I did.
Texas.
I want to bring it up. Sorry, quick clip from Eric Erickson, your gut.
My gut says take Pepto-Bismol.
That's enough. You guys sort of get the point, right? That's exciting, right? It's interesting. They're sort of making their predictions and they're fighting and they're disagreeing about things, right? But the expertise that they're bringing is real-world experience. None of them are trained political scientists, but they have all worked in applied politics for a long time. And so what they have is very valuable. But they're not doing what Jay Levine was doing, right? They're not going through and interviewing people and collecting information. They're not presenting anything in an objective way. In fact, they're presenting the same information in very different ways and spinning it and making arguments. And that's what's exciting. Anderson Cooper, of course, is playing the role of the host here. He is a reporter, but he's not playing a reporter in this context, right? He's playing the role of the host here. So we have a completely different context than we saw in the last one. And then there's analysts, right? Some analysts are trained people who have expertise in academic settings, and others are people that have real world experience. But let's take a look at this little clip that was put together from Emory University.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
You're bored already, right? You're totally bored right now.
Absolutely, we get a tremendous amount of contestation, and so we're still dealing with a very polarized body politic. So the electorate is polarized, and Congress is polarized.
The president's going to make a push to try to get Congress to agree to some sort of compromise on taxes and spending.
We have to deal with the debt in some way. We're $16 trillion in debt. We've got more than $1 trillion in deficit this year. So we're spending more money than we're taking in. And at some point, this just won't work anymore.
So the interesting thing about a second term is that he gets to preside over the implementation of healthcare. And so we will get a chance to see by 2016 how effective or ineffective certain aspects of the healthcare legislation are and whether or not certain things need to be tweaked.
But even though the law was passed, there's still a question of exactly how it will be implemented, and particularly what will happen with the expansion of Medicaid coverage.
That's great. You can't take it anymore. You can't take it anymore. These are all really smart people. I know some of them. They're really smart people, and they're saying really smart things, but it's like watching paint dry. It's like watching paint dry. You can understand, I mean, compare this to the last clip that we saw. Nobody's disagreeing with it. It's very measured. It's very monotone. They got books behind them, right? Big books, like really big books, like the kind that nobody would read. So there's a particular context here and a particular time for it. And Emory University puts this out as sort of a public service. It's sort of the way we do Tip Talks, right? To say we're going to share the expertise of our faculty with others. But the question then is, why do mainstream media sources not do this more? Why don't we see more political scientists, for instance, or more other academics in these types of settings? Why aren't they doing the kinds of things like we see here? And I think you can answer the question for yourself, because this is not a ratings grab, right? No, this isn't sexy enough to sort of get a lot of ratings. Now, here's the problem though. They all look the same, right? Besides the books aren't there, right? I mean, we can play, anybody's old enough to remember one of these things is not like the other. We can sort of play that game. But you know, a couple of these folks have doctoral degrees. Some of them don't. Some of them are trained as journalists. Some of them aren't. Some of them are hosts of shows. Others are guests. But it doesn't matter, because if you look at that, they all look the same. They all look just like I looked on that first slide that I showed you, right? And so the question is, and the challenge for us, I think, is how do we make sense of this? Now, how do we figure out what we're supposed to be getting? If we're right of what Lynch was encouraging us to do and what Nick Kristof over the weekend was encouraging faculty to do, that there's something unique to be gained by hearing faculty voices, having academics speak. Not that it's better, but that it's different, and that it's a voice that's not heard very much. How are we supposed to know when we're getting that? And how are we supposed to encourage networks to sort of put us on? Melissa Harris Perry is a political scientist. Right? She's a working political scientist, meaning she's publishing, she's still teaching at Tulane, but on the weekends she has her own show on MSNBC. But this is rare. It was a huge thing when she got it, because political scientists generally don't have their own shows. Why? Because nobody wants to hear us. I know who's going to pay money. But she does it a couple days a week, but there's a context here, and there's a specific audience for it. And Kristof's arguing that audience might be broader than we think. I'm not so sure. I would hope so. I mean, anybody watches Melissa Harris Perry? What does her group of people watch? What does she call it? Anybody know? It's Nerdland. Nerdland. She welcomes you every week to come to Nerdland. Right? Why? Because it's not going to be a sensationalistic show. It's going to be a show full of expert commentary, personal stories that is framed by academic discourse, right? So we need to be thinking through things like that. Well, if you're looking for me, you can find me, Political Science House, just down the street, doing Tip Talks every once in a while. I put most of my media analysis on my YouTube channel. But again, check out my hits. I'm not getting a lot of advertising revenue from YouTube, right? Because why? Is it that important, right? I think we might argue that it is, or that what we have to say might be of value. But let's close with this quote. This is again from the Foreign Policy piece by Mark Lynch. He says, seriously engaging with today's public means getting over a certain snobbery. Some people think that writing for an informed audience is easy compared with the demands of real academic, an informal audience rather, is easy compared with the demands of writing for a real academic audience. That's wrong. Sure, writing casual opinion pieces in an afternoon is easier than constructing a densely argued, empirically rich academic journal article, But good public academic writing should be building upon the hard work of scholarship, translating it for and crossing over into different audience with different expectations and demands. Nick Kristof puts it much more succinctly because he's writing for the New York Times, it has to be short. Professors, don't cloister yourselves like medieval monks. We need you. You can decide. Thanks.